The wind shifted first, soft at dawn, then sharp by midday. Trees bent unnaturally, their leaves whispering warnings no one could decipher. Raven stood at the edge of the summit, her cloak heavy with frost, though the season had not yet turned. The mark on her shoulder, once a quiet ember, now pulsed with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat. It glowed, fierce, erratic, alive. Villagers below watched the skies darken. Clouds gathered in spirals, thick and low, casting shadows that danced across the valley. Rain fell in bursts, then stopped without reason. Lightning cracked in silence. The animals grew restless. Birds flew in crooked patterns. Wolves howled at midday. The land itself seemed to recoil from something unseen. Raven clenched her fists, trying to will the mark into stillness, but it burned hotter, brighter. Her breath came in short bursts, each one visible in the cold air. She had felt its power before, during the hunt, during the trials, but never like this. This was not a surge. This was a warning. Ash arrived breathless, his boots soaked from the marsh. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, then at the sky, then back again. "It's starting," he said quietly. Raven didn't answer. She couldn't. The mark had begun to hum, a low, vibrating sound that echoed in her bones. The elders gathered at dusk. They spoke in hushed tones, casting glances toward the summit. Some believed it was prophecy, others feared it was punishment. The mark had always been a symbol of leadership, of strength, but now it was something else, something wild, something untethered. That night the temperature dropped unnaturally. Frost crept across the stones, even as fire crackled in the hearths. Children dreamed of storms. Mothers awoke to find their wells frozen. The mark glowed through Raven's cloak, casting light even in sleep. She dreamt of spirals, endless, shifting, consuming. By morning, the valley had changed. Rivers ran slower, the soil turned brittle, crops wilted under a sun that no longer warmed. Raven stood again at the summit, her eyes scanning the horizon. She felt the weight of every gaze, every hope, every fear. The mark pulsed once more, then flared, sending a ripple through the air. Birds scattered, trees groaned, the sky split with light. And Raven whispered, not to Ash, not to the elders, but to the mark itself. "What are you becoming?" The wind did not answer, but the land did. It trembled, softly, like a breath held too long. The transformation had begun.
Ash had always seen things others could not. Flickers in the corner of his eye. Whispers in the wind that carried no voice. But now, the visions came with weight. They pressed against his chest like stone, heavy and urgent. Sleep offered no escape. Dreams twisted into prophecy. He stood alone in the clearing, eyes wide, breath shallow. The trees around him shimmered, not with light, but with memory. Bark peeled back to reveal carvings that pulsed like veins. Symbols he had never studied, never read, yet somehow understood. They spoke of cycles, of power, of endings that masqueraded as beginnings. The ground beneath him cracked, not physically, but in his mind. He saw ruins buried beneath the valley floor, towers broken by time, altars stained with something older than blood, and always the spiral. It appeared in every vision, etched into stone, drawn in ash, carved into bone. It turned slowly, endlessly, as if waiting. Ash stumbled back, clutching his head. The visions did not fade. They layered over reality like fog. He saw the summit as it was, and as it would be, split open, swallowed by light, Raven stood at its center, her mark blazing, her eyes distant. Around her wolves knelt, not in fear, in worship. He tried to speak, but his voice was lost in the wind. The symbols burned behind his eyelids. He saw them in water, in fire, in the eyes of strangers. They followed him. They called to him. And somewhere deep within, he felt the truth he could not name. The elders noticed his silence. They asked questions he could not answer. He scribbled the symbols in charcoal, but they faded before morning. He described the ruins, but no map matched his words. They thought him cursed, touched, changed. Raven found him at dusk, seated beneath the old tree. He looked at her, and for a moment, he saw her as she might become. Cloaked in shadow, crowned in light. Her mark no longer a symbol, but a doorway. He blinked, and the image was gone. I see things. Things that haven't happened. Things that shouldn't. Raven didn't flinch. She simply nodded. Then we must find out why. That night, Ash dreamed again. The spiral turned faster. The ruins crumbled. And in the center of it all, a voice echoed. Not in words, but in feeling. It said, "You are the witness. You are the warning." Ash woke with tears on his face. The symbols danced across the walls. And he knew whatever was coming, it had already begun.
They came at twilight, silent, cloaked in ash and fur. Their eyes gleamed with reverence, not fear. Their leader, a tall figure with silver streaks in his mane, knelt before Raven without a word. Around him, others followed suit. Wolves, once scattered and wild, now gathered in formation. Not as hunters, not as warriors, but as believers. Raven stood motionless, the mark on her shoulder pulsing with quiet light. She felt their gaze like heat on her skin. These were not the clans she had known. They bore no sigils, no weapons, only symbols etched into their flesh, spirals, moons, and the shape of her mark replicated in charcoal and blood. Ash watched from the ridge, unease tightening in his chest. He had seen devotion before, but this was something else, something ancient, something dangerous. The silver-maned wolf spoke at last. His voice was low, melodic like wind through hollow stone. "You are the bearer, the one foretold. The mark is not a curse, it is the sign." Raven's lips parted, but no words came. She had led warriors, she had faced storms, but never had she been worshipped. They called themselves the Hollow Howl, a name drawn from old songs, forgotten by most. They claimed to have seen her in dreams long before her birth. They spoke of prophecy, of a cycle broken, of a leader who would not rule, but awaken. The elders were wary. They questioned the Hollow Howl's motives. But the wolves did not seek power. They sought presence. They followed Raven not for conquest, but for clarity. They believed her mark was the key to the spiral, that through her, the truth would rise. Raven met with them beneath the moon. She asked no questions. She listened. And in their stories, she heard echoes of her own dreams, whispers, symbols, the tremors beneath the summit. It was all connected. Ash confronted her after the gathering. "They see you as divine. That's not leadership. That's worship." Raven turned slowly. Her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the stars. "I didn't ask for it." "No," Ash said, "but they'll follow you anyway." The Hollow Howl began to spread. Word traveled fast, through forests, across rivers, into the mountains. More wolves arrived, each bearing the mark in some form. They built altars of stone and bone. They sang in spirals. They waited. And Raven, caught between fear and fate, stood at the center of it all. She was no longer just a leader. She was becoming a symbol.
The summit was no longer a place of strategy. It had become a battlefield of belief. Raven stood at its center, surrounded by leaders whose eyes once held trust. Now they flickered with doubt. The hollow howl had grown, their chants echoing through the valley. Their devotion was fierce, but it cast long shadows. The clans gathered in silence. Fire crackled in the stone pit, but no warmth reached the circle. Raven's mark glowed beneath her cloak, a constant reminder of the power she could not control. She spoke with clarity, with strength, but her words landed like stones in water, rippling, then sinking. Ash stood beside her, his visions growing darker. He saw fractures in the alliance, lines drawn not by territory, but by fear. Some clans whispered of prophecy, others spoke of containment. A few began to question whether Raven's leadership was still earned, or simply inherited by fate. Raven met with the elders one by one. She offered plans, reassurances, unity. But unity was fragile. The mark had changed everything. It was no longer just a symbol, it was a force. And forces, no matter how noble, demanded control. At night, Raven walked the summit alone. The wind carried voices. Real or imagined, she could no longer tell. She heard her name spoken in reverence, in warning, in fear. The trees seemed to lean away from her. The earth felt brittle beneath her steps. Ash found her at dawn, staring into the valley. "They're afraid," he said. "I know," she replied. "They think you're becoming something else." Raven turned to him, her eyes tired but resolute. "Then I'll show them I'm still me." But even she wasn't sure. The hollow howl began building shrines. They lit fires in a spiral pattern. They sang songs older than memory. Other clans watched with unease. Some joined. Others withdrew. The alliance, once forged in blood and trust, now trembled under the weight of belief. A storm rolled in, unnatural, fast, and silent. Lightning struck the summit, splitting a stone pillar in two. The mark on Raven's shoulder flared, casting light across the circle. Wolves bowed. Elders stepped back, and Raven felt something stir inside her. Not rage, not fear, something deeper, something ancient. She raised her voice above the wind. "We are stronger together. This mark does not divide us. It reminds us of what we've survived." But the silence that followed was louder than any storm. The alliance held, for now, but cracks had formed, and beneath them, something waited.
It began with a sound, low, distant, like thunder buried beneath the earth. Raven paused mid-step, her breath catching as the ground beneath her boots shivered. The summit, long thought immovable, groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Ash turned sharply, eyes scanning the horizon. The wind had stilled. The sky hung heavy, painted in bruised shades of gray. Then the tremor came again, stronger this time. Stones rolled from their resting places. Dust rose in spirals. The mountain itself seemed to exhale. The clans rushed to the summit, their voices hushed, their movements cautious. Raven stood at the center, her mark glowing faintly, as if responding to the quake. Beneath her feet, the stone cracked, not violently, but with purpose. Lines etched themselves into the ground, glowing with a pale blue light. Symbols emerged, ancient, intricate, alive. spirals, eyes, and shapes that defied language. They pulsed in rhythm with Raven's mark. The summit had hidden them for generations, buried beneath layers of time and silence. Now, they revealed themselves like memories long suppressed. Ash knelt beside one of the symbols, tracing its edge with trembling fingers. These weren't carved, they were grown. The elders arrived, their faces pale. Some recognized the symbols from old scrolls, forbidden texts, stories whispered in fear. They spoke of the first spiral, of a power buried to protect the world from itself. The summit, they said, was not just a meeting place. It was a seal. Raven felt the weight of the moment press against her chest. The symbols called to her, not with words, but with feeling. She felt flashes in her mind, a chamber deep below, a voice without form, a choice waiting to be made. The hollow howl knelt in reverence, their chants rising like smoke. Other clans backed away, uncertain, afraid. The alliance teetered on the edge of belief and dread. Then the ground shook once more, brief, sharp, final. The symbols flared, then dimmed, leaving behind a faint glow. Raven stepped forward, placing her hand on the largest spiral. It was warm. It pulsed. It knew her. Ash touched her arm. "This is what I saw. In the visions, the symbols, the chamber, it's all real." Raven nodded slowly. "Then we go deeper."
Sleep no longer brought rest. It brought voices. Raven lay beneath the woven furs, eyes closed, breath steady, but her mind drifted into places untouched by light. The dreams came in fragments, a spiral turning in endless silence, a voice without a mouth, a name spoken in languages she did not know, yet somehow understood. The whispers began softly, like wind brushing against stone. They did not speak in words, but in feeling, urgency, hunger, invitation. They called her not by title, not by name, but by the mark. It pulsed in her sleep, glowing faintly through the fabric, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Ash noticed the change. She woke with her eyes distant, her voice slower, her thoughts tangled in symbols and riddles. She spoke of places she had never seen, chambers beneath the summit, doors carved from bone, a spiral that turned not in stone, but in time. The elders grew uneasy. They whispered of dream sickness, of the old tales where leaders were touched by something deeper and never returned the same. But Raven did not fear the dreams. She welcomed them. She listened. Each night the whispers grew louder. They spoke of dissent, of truth buried beneath memory, of a choice waiting in the dark. Raven saw flashes, her own face older, changed, her mark glowing like a beacon, wolves kneeling, Ash weeping, a chamber opening. She began to draw the symbols in her waking hours, spirals, eyes, paths that led nowhere. The hollow howl watched in reverence. Others watched in dread. The alliance, already fragile, now trembled beneath the weight of prophecy. Ash confronted her. "You're not sleeping, you're searching." Raven nodded. "They're calling me." "Who?" She looked past him, toward the summit. The spiral. That night, the dreams shifted. She stood in a vast chamber, walls breathing, symbols glowing. The whispers became a chorus. They spoke of power, of legacy, of a cycle waiting to be broken. She reached
before the spiral and awoke with her hand outstretched, trembling. The mark flared once more, not in pain, in recognition. Raven rose before dawn, her eyes clear, her voice steady. We go beneath the summit. There's something waiting. Ash hesitated. And if it's not meant to be found? Raven turned to him, the whispers still echoing in her mind. They're calling me. The wind stirred. The valley held its breath. And the spiral waited.
The summit was quiet now, too quiet. Raven stood at the edge of the fissure, the symbols beneath her feet still glowing faintly. The tremors had stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the quake itself. Ash joined her, his eyes scanning the cracks that had split the stone. Beneath them, darkness waited. They descended at dawn. The path was narrow, carved not by tools but by time. The walls pulsed with faint light, the symbols etched into the stone growing more intricate with each step. Raven's mark responded, glowing softly, then flaring as they passed certain thresholds. It was guiding her, or warning her. She couldn't tell. Ash moved cautiously, his visions pressing against his thoughts like fog. He saw flashes, Raven standing alone, the chamber opening, the spiral turning. He didn't speak of them. Not yet. The air grew colder, the light dimmed. The ruins opened into a vast corridor, lined with statues of creatures neither human nor beast. Their eyes followed the pair, carved in expressions of sorrow and reverence. Dust hung in the air like memory. Raven paused before a sealed door, massive, ancient, untouched. Symbols danced across its surface, shifting as she approached. Her mark flared, and the door responded. A low hum filled the chamber. Stone groaned. The seal cracked. Ash stepped back. This place wasn't meant to be found. Raven touched the door. Then why does it know me? The seal broke with a whisper, not a roar. The chamber beyond was vast, circular, hollow, alive. The walls breathed. The spiral was everywhere, etched into the floor, the ceiling, the very air. It turned slowly, endlessly, casting shadows that moved without light. They stepped inside. The ground beneath them pulsed. The symbols glowed brighter. Raven felt her mark burn, not in pain, but in recognition. She was not intruding. She was returning. Ash knelt, tracing a spiral with his fingers. This is older than the hunt, older than the bloodborne. Raven nodded. Older than memory. The chamber spoke in silence. Whispers filled the air, not with words, but with weight. The spiral turned, the mark glowed, and Raven felt something awaken, not within the ruins, but within herself. They had come seeking answers, but the spiral had been waiting.
The air grew heavier as Raven and Ash moved deeper into the ruins. The walls narrowed, the light dimmed, and the silence became absolute. Even their footsteps seemed reluctant to echo. The symbols that had guided them faded, replaced by smooth stone, untouched, unmarked, ancient. Then they saw it. A chamber, sealed by a door unlike any they had seen. It was not carved. It was grown, woven from stone and metal, spiraled and seamless. No hinges, no handle, just presence. It radiated age, not centuries, not millennia, something older, something outside time. Ash stepped forward, his breath shallow. "This isn't part of the ruins," he whispered. "It's beneath them, beneath everything." Raven approached slowly. Her mark flared, not violently, but with recognition. The door responded, pulsing once, then settling into stillness. She placed her hand against it. The surface was warm, alive. Symbols began to emerge, faint, glowing, shifting. They were not of the hunt, not of the bloodborne. They belonged to something forgotten, a language lost before language began. Raven saw spirals within spirals, eyes within eyes, a cycle that had no beginning, no end. Ash knelt beside the threshold, tracing the edge with his fingers. "This chamber predates the clans," he said, "predates the wars. Even the spiral itself may have come from here." Raven didn't speak. She felt the weight of the chamber pressing against her thoughts. It was not just sealed, it was waiting, guarded not by stone, but by silence. She saw flashes again, visions from her dreams, the chamber opening, light pouring out, her mark burning brighter than the sun. The Hollow Hall had no stories of this place. The elders had no records. Even Ash's visions had only hinted at its existence, and yet it felt familiar, like a memory buried in bone. Raven stepped back. "We're not ready," she said. Ash looked up. "Then why did it let us find it?" The chamber remained sealed. The symbols faded, but the presence lingered. It watched. It listened. They left the ruins in silence, the path behind them unchanged. But something had shifted. The spiral had shown us its origin, or perhaps its end. And Raven knew whatever lay beyond that door, it was not meant to be opened lightly.
The chamber pulsed with silence. Raven stood at its center, her mark glowing steadily, casting soft light across the spiraled floor. Ash lingered near the entrance, his breath shallow, his visions pressing against his thoughts like waves. The walls shimmered, not with light, but with memory. And then the spiral spoke. It was not a voice. It was a presence, a weight, a knowing. Raven felt it first in her chest, a pull, gentle but firm. Her thoughts slowed, her breath stilled. The chamber darkened, and the spiral turned, slowly, purposefully. Symbols flared across the walls, forming patterns that danced and dissolved. Then came the words, not spoken, not heard, felt. "You are the bearer, the cycle bends for you." Raven's knees weakened, but she did not fall. The spiral's presence wrapped around her, ancient and vast. It showed her visions of wolves shifting at will, of clans united under one rhythm, of power flowing without pain. She saw herself standing above the valley, her mark blazing, her voice commanding the winds. "Take it," the spiral whispered. "Take control. No more limits, no more fear." Ash stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Raven, don't listen. It's showing you what you want, not what's true." But Raven couldn't look away. The spiral revealed more, shifting without consequence, healing without cost, leading without resistance. She saw the clans kneeling, not in worship, but in harmony. She saw herself as the center of it all. "You are the key," the spiral said. "You are the end of chaos." Her mark flared, brighter than ever. The chamber responded, symbols rising from the floor, spinning in slow orbit around her. She felt her body shift, not fully, but enough to taste the power. It was intoxicating, pure, whole. Ash reached for her. "This isn't control. It's surrender." Raven turned to him, her eyes glowing. What if it's both? The spiral pulsed once more, offering its final gift, complete mastery over shifting. No pain, no loss, no boundaries. "Say yes," it whispered, "and become." Raven stood in silence, the offer burning in her mind. She saw the future it promised. She saw the cost it hid. And she whispered, "Not yet." The spiral dimmed, the symbols faded, the chamber fell still. Ash exhaled, relief and dread mingling in his breath. Raven turned away from the center, her mark quiet once more. But the offer remained, waiting.
Ash hadn't slept in 2 nights. The visions were no longer confined to dreams. They bled into waking moments, flickering behind his eyes like distant fires. He saw Raven standing in the center of the spiral chamber, her mark blazing, her form shifting into something that no longer resembled the woman he knew. Her voice echoed, distorted and hollow, and the clans knelt not in unity, but in fear. He found her at the edge of the ruins, staring into the valley below. The wind carried a strange warmth, unnatural for the season, and the sky held a hue that felt borrowed from another world. Raven's mark pulsed steadily, no longer erratic, but deliberate, as if it had found its rhythm. She didn't turn when Ash approached, but she spoke as if she had been waiting. "They're calling again," she said quietly. "Every night, louder." Ash stepped beside her, his voice low and strained. "I know. I see what they're asking of you. I see what you become if you answer." Raven finally looked at him, her eyes sharp but distant. "You think I'll lose myself?" "I think you already are," he replied. "Not all at once, just enough that you don't notice." She didn't argue. Instead, she walked slowly along the ridge, her fingers grazing the stone as if searching for something beneath its surface. What if becoming something else is the only way to protect them? Ash followed, his steps heavy. Then who protects you from what you become? The question lingered in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Raven paused, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the clans had begun to gather again, some in support, others in quiet resistance. The hollow howl had grown more fervent, their rituals more elaborate. The elders had grown more cautious, their meetings more frequent, and the mark, ever present, had begun to hum even in daylight. Ash reached into his satchel and pulled out a charcoal sketch, symbols from his latest vision. They twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled Raven's mark, but warped, stretched, broken. "This is what I saw last night. You weren't leading, you were consuming." She studied the drawing, her expression unreadable. Maybe it's just one path. Or maybe it's the only one the spiral wants you to see. They stood in silence as the wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of stone and fire. Raven closed her eyes, listening to the whispers that had become her nightly companions. She didn't speak of them anymore, not to Ash, not to the elders. But they were there, always just beneath the surface. Ash placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to go deeper." Raven opened her eyes, the glow of her mark casting a faint light across his face. "I've already have."
Training had always been Raven's anchor. The rhythm of movement, the discipline of breath, the clarity of purpose. It kept her grounded. But lately, even the simplest forms felt unstable. Her mark, once a quiet companion, now surged unpredictably. During sparring, her shifts came too fast, too strong. Her body blurred between forms, leaving trails of light and shadow that lingered longer than they should. The others noticed. Warriors stepped back. Elders watched him silence. The hollow howl called it ascension, a sign that she was nearing full awakening. But Ash saw something else. Strain. Her control was slipping, and the spiral's influence was growing. During one session, Raven attempted a controlled shift mid-strike. Her form twisted, not into the wolf she knew, but into something half-formed, flickering between shapes. Her opponent dropped their blade and stumbled away. The air around her crackled. Stones beneath her feet split. The mark flared violently, casting light across the training grounds. She collapsed to one knee, breath ragged, eyes wide. Ash rushed to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're pushing too hard. This isn't mastery. It's unraveling." Raven shook her head, trying to steady herself. "I need to understand it. I need to be ready." "For what?" Ash asked. "To become something no one can follow?" The question hung in the air. Around them the warriors whispered, some with awe, others with fear. The Alliance was watching, and every misstep fed the growing divide. Later that evening, Raven stood alone beneath the moonlight, practicing slow forms. Her movements were graceful, but the mark pulsed erratically. She shifted without meaning to, her limbs elongating, her senses sharpening, then fading. She felt herself slipping, not just physically, but mentally. The spiral's whispers had grown louder, more insistent. They spoke of power, of inevitability, of surrender. Ash approached quietly, holding a bowl of water. "You're burning yourself out. Even the spiral has limits." She took the bowl, her hands trembling. "It doesn't feel like it has any." "That's the danger. It wants you to believe that." She looked at him, eyes tired but resolute. "If I don't learn to control it, someone else will try to control me." Ash didn't argue. He simply sat beside her, watching the stars shift overhead. The night was quiet, but the tension beneath it was growing. The clans had begun to choose sides. Some trained harder, preparing to defend her. Others trained in secret, preparing to stop her. And Raven, caught between prophecy and fear, continued to train, knowing that each step forward brought her closer to something she might not be able to return from.
The valley no longer echoed with song or ceremony. It echoed with steel. Word of Raven's descent into the spiral chamber had spread faster than fire in dry grass. Some called it revelation. Others called it betrayal. The Alliance, once held together by shared purpose, now fractured into factions, each preparing for what they believed was inevitable. The hollow howl fortified their camps, carving symbols into their armor and painting spirals across their shields. They trained relentlessly, not for conquest, but for protection. To them, Raven was the chosen bearer, the one who would reshape the world. They would defend her with blood, if necessary. Across the river, the Stonefang and Emberclaw clans gathered in silence. Their elders spoke of balance, of history, of the dangers of unchecked power. They remembered the old stories, the first spiral bearer, the wars that followed, the cost of godhood. To them, Raven was no longer a leader. She was a threat. Ash moved between camps, trying to hold the threads together. His visions had grown more vivid, more urgent. He saw fire raining from the sky, wolves turning on each other, the spiral consuming everything. He pleaded for unity, for patience, but the clans had already begun to choose. Weapons were sharpened, scouts were sent, old alliances were revisited, and old grudges resurfaced. The valley, once a place of gathering, now braced for war. Even the land seemed to sense it. Storms lingered longer, animals fled deeper into the forest, and the sky held a permanent shade of warning. Raven stood at the summit, watching the preparations unfold. Her mark pulsed steadily, no longer wild, but deliberate. She felt the weight of every choice, every whisper, every prophecy. She had not asked for this war, but she could no longer stop it. Ash joined her, his face drawn, his voice quiet. "They're ready to fight. Some for you, some against you." Raven didn't look away from the valley. "Then I need to be ready too." He hesitated. "You don't have to become what they fear." She turned to him, her eyes steady. "But I might have to become what they need." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of steel and smoke. The clans moved like tides, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. And at the center of it all stood Raven, marked by the spiral, caught between salvation and destruction. The war had not yet begun, but its shape was already carved into the land.
Reality began to bend around Raven like heat over stone. It started subtly, moments repeating, voices echoing with slight delay. shadows stretching longer than they should. The mark on her shoulder no longer pulsed in rhythm. It surged unpredictably, casting flickers of light that distorted the air around her. During council meetings, she would speak and then hear her own words again, slightly altered, as if spoken by another version of herself. Ash noticed first. He watched her eyes glaze over mid-sentence, then snap back with no memory of what she just said. She dismissed it as exhaustion, but the signs multiplied. Time lost its shape. Raven walked through the valley and saw the same child twice, once laughing, once crying, within seconds. She reached for her blade during training and found it already in her hand. Her dreams bled into waking hours, and her waking hours felt like dreams. The spiral's influence was no longer confined to her thoughts, it was leaking into the world. The hollow howl called it ascension. They believed she was crossing into a higher state, one where past and future converged. They followed her more fervently, convinced she was becoming the embodiment of the spiral itself. But others grew fearful. Elders whispered of the old stories, leaders who touched the spiral and unraveled the world around them. Ash confronted her beneath the old tree, the one that had stood since the first alliance. "You're slipping," he said, "not just in control, in time, in memory." Raven looked at him, her expression distant. "I feel everything, all at once. The past, the future, the spiral doesn't move forward, it turns." He stepped closer. "You're not meant to carry all of it." She didn't respond. Her mark flared, and, for a moment, the tree behind her shimmered, its leaves green, then gold, then gone. Ash blinked and the moment passed, but the fear remained. The clans began to notice. Warriors reported seeing Raven in 2 places at once. Scouts claimed she spoke to them in dreams and then greeted them in daylight with no memory of it. The valley itself seemed to shift. Paths changed, stones moved, the stars above flickered in unfamiliar patterns. Raven stood at the summit, her eyes scanning a horizon that no longer held shape. She felt the spiral turning inside her, not as a guide, but as a force. It was no longer asking, it was becoming. And reality, once firm beneath her feet, now trembled with every step she took.
They came from the northern ridge, cloaked in red and silence. The Bloodborn had been absent for years, their name preserved only in cautionary tales and fading memory. But now, they returned, not as warriors seeking alliance, but as guardians bearing a warning. Their leader, Kyle, stepped forward with eyes that had seen too much. Her armor bore the spiral not as a symbol of power, but as a scar. Raven met them at the summit, her mark glowing faintly beneath her cloak. Kyle spoke with calm certainty, her voice steady and low. "We've seen what the spiral becomes when left unchecked. We've buried the ruins, we've buried the dead, and we've buried the truth. But it rises again. And this time, it wears your face." Ash stood beside Raven, watching Kyle closely. Her words weren't threats, they were memories. She carried the weight of history, and she had come to prevent it from repeating. The Bloodborn revealed scrolls, brittle and ancient, marked with symbols that mirrored those in Raven's dreams. They told of the first spiral bearer, of the wars that followed, of the unraveling of reality itself. The Hollow Howl rejected their message outright. To them, Kyle's arrival was blasphemy. They saw the Raven's transformation as sacred, the spiral as a gift, and the Bloodborn as cowards who had turned away from destiny. Tensions flared, words sharpened. The valley, already fractured, now stood on the brink of collapse. Raven listened to both sides, her thoughts tangled. She had felt the spiral's pull, its promise, its hunger. She had seen glimpses of what it could offer and what it could take. The Bloodborne's arrival forced her to confront a question she had avoided. Was the spiral meant to be mastered or buried? Ash urged caution. They're not here to fight. They're here to stop something they've seen before. Raven nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on Kyle. And if sealing it means sealing me, Kyle didn't flinch. Then we do what must be done. The valley held its breath. The clans watched. And Raven, caught between prophecy and history, stood at the center of a choice that could reshape everything. The spiral turned, and the past returned to warn the future.
Ash had always stood beside Raven. Through the trials, the hunts, the rise of the Hollow Howl, he had been her anchor. But now, the ground beneath them was shifting, and he no longer knew which way to hold her. The spiral's influence was growing stronger. Raven's mark flared even in sleep, and her voice carried echoes of something not entirely her own. He watched her from a distance as she trained alone, her movements fluid but unnatural, her form blurred between shapes, her eyes glowing with a light that didn't belong to this world. She spoke less, listened more, to whispers only she could hear, and when she did speak, her words felt rehearsed, as if borrowed from something ancient. Ash's visions had grown darker. He saw Raven standing at the center of a battlefield, her mark blazing, her body shifting into something monstrous. Clans fled, the valley burned, and in every vision he stood alone, watching her become the very thing they feared. He tried to reason with her. "You're changing," he said. "Not just your power, you." Raven looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm becoming what the spiral needs." Ash stepped closer. "And what if that's not what we need?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, her mark pulsing in rhythm with the symbols carved into the summit stone. The Hollow Howl had begun to speak of her in reverent tones, calling her the spiral's voice. The Bloodborne grew more urgent, warning that the seal must be restored before it was too late. Ash stood between them, torn by loyalty and fear. He remembered the girl who had led them through the frost, who had fought beside him without hesitation, but the woman before him now was something else, something becoming. He met with Kale in secret, asking questions he never thought he'd ask. "If it comes to it," he said, "how do we stop her?" Kale's answer was simple. "You don't. You choose." Ash returned to the summit, watching Raven as she stood beneath the stars, her mark casting spirals across the stone. He felt the weight of every moment, every memory, every promise. To protect her might mean losing everything. To stop her might mean losing her. And the spiral kept turning.
The visions came without warning. Raven had been meditating beneath the summit, her breath steady, her thoughts quiet, when the world around her shifted. The stone beneath her hands grew warm, then cold, then vanished. She opened her eyes and found herself standing in a place she had never seen, yet somehow recognized. The chamber was vast and silent, its walls carved with spirals that pulsed like veins. At its center stood a figure cloaked in shadow and light, neither young nor old, neither beast nor human. Raven stepped forward, her mark glowing in response. The figure turned, and she saw her own eyes reflected back, older, deeper, filled with memory. It was her ancestor, the first spiral bearer. The figure did not speak, but the vision spoke for her. Raven saw flashes of a time long buried, clans united under one banner, the spiral used not for power, but for balance. She saw the bearer guiding,
healing, sacrificing. But then the spiral grew hungry. It whispered promises. It offered control. And the bearer, once revered, became feared. Raven watched as the vision twisted. The clans turned. The valley fractured. The spiral consumed its bearer, not with fire, but with silence. The figure faded into legend, her name erased, her legacy buried beneath stone and secrecy. Ash found Raven hours later, still seated in silence, her eyes distant. She told him what she saw, her voice quiet, but steady. She was me, or I was her. I don't know, but she tried to hold it, and it broke her. Ash listened, his expression unreadable. Then maybe the spiral isn't meant to be held. Raven nodded slowly, or maybe it's meant to be understood. The vision lingered long after the moment passed. Raven saw her ancestor in dreams, in reflections, and the movement of the wind. She felt her presence in the mark, in the spiral's rhythm, in the choices she now faced. The hollow howl called it destiny. The bloodborne called it warning. Raven called it memory. And memory, she now understood, was not just a record of what had been. It was a guide for what must come next.
The summit, once a place of unity, had become a battlefield of silence. The clans no longer met in open council. They gathered in corners, behind closed tents, speaking in hushed tones and guarded glances. The spiral's influence had spread beyond Raven. It had seeped into the land, into the minds of those who once stood beside her. The hollow howl remained loyal, their devotion deepening with each flare of Raven's mark. They saw her as the spiral's chosen, the one who would lead them into a new age. Their rituals grew louder, their numbers swelled, and their eyes burned with purpose. But not all clans shared their faith. Stonefang withdrew first, citing the visions Ash had shared and the warnings brought by the Bloodborne. They claimed Raven's power had grown unstable, that her presence distorted the valley itself. Emberclaw followed, their warriors refusing to train under her command. They spoke of balance, of tradition, of the danger in letting one voice echo louder than all others. Raven tried to hold the alliance together. She met with elders, offered transparency, even stood before the clans without her cloak, her mark exposed. But the gesture only deepened the divide. Some saw vulnerability, others saw threat. Ash watched the unraveling with quiet dread. He had hoped the truth would bring clarity, but it only sharpened the lines. The spiral had become more than a symbol. It was now a question, and each clan answered it differently. Whispers turned to declarations. A faction led by Emberclaw and Stonefang formally broke from the alliance, declaring Raven a danger to the valley's future. They called for containment, for isolation, for a return to the old ways. The Hollow Howl responded with defiance, vowing to protect Raven at all costs. Skirmishes broke out along the river. Scouts vanished. Messages were intercepted. The valley, once held together by shared memory, now fractured under the weight of fear and prophecy. Raven stood at the summit, watching the fires burn in the distance. Her mark pulsed steadily, no longer wild, but resolute. She felt the spiral turning within her, not as a guide, but as a burden. The clans had made their choice, and now she had to make hers. Ash approached, his voice quiet. "They won't come back." Raven nodded. "Then I'll go forward." The wind carried the scent of smoke and frost. The stars above flickered, uncertain, and the valley, divided and trembling, waited for what would come next.
The summit was quiet, blanketed in frost and tension. Fires burned low in scattered camps, their light flickering against the stone as if unsure whether to stay or fade. The clans had fractured beyond repair, some prepared for war, Others withdrew into silence, and Raven stood alone at the edge, her mark glowing with a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of her breath. She had heard every argument. The hollow howl begged her to embrace the spiral fully, to become what they believed she was destined to be. The Bloodborne warned her to seal it, to sacrifice herself before the valley was consumed. Ash, torn between loyalty and fear, had stopped offering advice. He simply watched her now, waiting for the choice she had to make. Raven walked to summit one last time, tracing the symbols carved into the stone. They pulsed faintly beneath her fingers, responding to her presence like old memories stirred awake. She remembered the vision of her ancestor, the first spiral bearer, and the silence that followed her fall. She remembered the tremors, the whispers, the chamber waiting beneath the earth. She returned to her tent and packed lightly. No armor, no blade, just the cloak she had worn since the hunt, and the mark that had never stopped glowing. Ash met her at the edge of camp, his eyes searching hers for something familiar. "You don't have to do this alone." Raven placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice calm. "I do. It's not just about power anymore. It's about understanding what it wants and what I'm willing to give." Ash nodded, though his eyes betrayed the weight of goodbye. "Then I'll wait, no matter what comes back." She smiled faintly, then turned toward the path that led to the spiral chamber. The valley was silent as she walked, the wind carrying no song, no warning. The ground beneath her felt steady, but the air shimmered with possibility. She passed the old tree, the broken altar, the place where the Alliance had once stood united. Each step was a memory, each breath a reckoning. The entrance to the chamber opened without resistance. The symbols glowed brighter, welcoming her back. She stepped inside, the spiral turning slowly at the center, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Raven stood before it, her mark flaring in response. She didn't speak. She didn't kneel. She simply watched it turn, waiting for it to speak. And when it did, she listened, not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as herself. The spiral had waited. Now it would be answered.
The chamber opened with no resistance. Raven stepped inside, alone, her mark glowing steadily as the stone door sealed behind her. The air was thick, not with dust or age, but with presence. The spiral was awake. The space was vast and circular, carved from a material that shimmered between stone and light. Symbols pulsed along the walls, not in patterns she recognized, but in rhythms she felt. The spiral turned slowly at the center, suspended in the air, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. Raven approached, her footsteps silent against the floor. The spiral's form was not a creature, not a voice, not a god. It was motion. It was memory. It was a cycle made visible. As she drew closer, it responded, not with sound, but with sensation. Her mark flared, and the chamber shifted. She saw herself reflected in the spiral, not as she was, but as she could be. 1,000 versions, each shaped by a different choice. In one, she ruled. In another, she wandered. In many, she was lost. The spiral showed her not a future, but all futures. It did not speak. It revealed. Raven reached out, her hand trembling. The spiral pulsed, and the chamber darkened. She was no longer standing. She was floating, surrounded by echoes of every moment she had lived. The hunt, the Alliance, Ash's warnings, her ancestors' fall. They spun around her like stars, orbiting the spiral's core. Then the spiral shifted. It drew her in, not physically, but spiritually. She felt her thoughts stretch, her memories unravel, her form blur. She was not being consumed. She was being understood, The spiral was not a force to wield. It was a mirror, and it had waited for someone who could see it clearly. Raven's mark burned, not in pain, but in clarity. She saw the valley, the clans, the war that loomed. She saw the cost of power, the weight of legacy, the danger of becoming more than herself. The spiral offered no answers, only truth. She landed softly, the chamber returning to stillness. The spiral hovered before her, unchanged, eternal. Raven stepped back, her breath steady, her eyes wide. She had met its true form, not a god, not a monster, but a cycle. One that could be continued or broken. She turned toward the sealed door, now open once more. The path back was clear, but the path forward had changed. The spiral had awakened, and Raven had seen what lay at its heart.
The spiral hovered in silence, its form shifting between light and shadow, motion and stillness. Raven stood before it, her mark burrowing in quiet rhythm, her breath steady despite the weight pressing against her thoughts. She had come seeking answers, expecting a voice, a presence, a god, but what she found was something far more elusive. The spiral did not speak, it revealed. Images unfolded around her, not visions but truths. She saw the valley as it had been, as it could be, as it might never be. Clans rising and falling, leaders crowned and broken, power passed from hand to hand, always with the same promise, control, and always with the same cost. She saw the first spiral bearer again, not as a figure of legend, but as a woman burdened by choice. Her mark had glown just as Raven's did now, and she too had stood in this chamber, facing the same cycle. The spiral had offered her mastery, and she had taken it. What followed was not peace, it was obedience, fear, endless war disguised as unity. Raven stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of the spiral's light. It pulsed in response, and the chamber shifted. She saw herself reflected in its motion, leading, commanding, reshaping the world, but behind every image was a shadow. The spiral did not grant freedom, it granted dominance, and dominance, once accepted, demanded permanence. She understood then, the spiral was not a being, it was a pattern, a loop, a system designed to repeat itself through those who bore its mark. It did not choose leaders, it created rulers, and once accepted, its influence could not be undone. Ash's warnings echoed in her mind, the blood-born scrolls, her ancestors' fall. They had all seen the same truth, but each had responded differently. Some sealed it, some worshipped it, some were consumed by it. Raven stepped back, her heart pounding. The spiral continued to turn, indifferent to her fear, her clarity, her resistance. It had no will, it had no mercy, it simply offered. And it waited. She looked down at her mark, now glowing softly, no longer flaring. It was quiet, listening. She had not answered yet, but the spiral had shown her everything. It was not a god. It was a cycle. And cycles, she now knew, could be broken.
Ash had waited as long as he could. The summit was quiet, the clans divided, and Raven had gone into the spiral chamber alone. He had promised to stay behind, to trust her choice, but the silence that followed her descent grew heavier with each passing hour. His visions had returned, sharper, darker. He saw her standing in the spiral's light, her form shifting, her voice fading into something not her own. He packed quickly. No armor, no weapons, just a torch, a satchel of herbs, and the memory of who Raven had been before the spiral began to speak. The path to the chamber was steep, carved by tremors and time. Symbols pulsed faintly along the walls, responding to his presence with a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. The spiral knew he was coming. Inside, the air was thick with motion. The chamber had changed. It no longer shimmered with quiet mystery. It pulsed with power. Ash stepped carefully, his breath steady, his thoughts focused. He called her name once, then again. No answer. Only the spiral's hum, low and constant like a heartbeat beneath the stone. He found her at the center, standing before the spiral, her mark glowing brighter than he had ever seen. She didn't turn when he approached. Her eyes were locked on the spiral's core, her body still, her presence distant. Ash felt the pull immediately, memories unraveling, time bending, the chamber pressing against his thoughts. He reached for her, but the spiral responded. A wave of energy surged between them, forcing him back. He stumbled, caught in a vision not his own. He saw Raven crowned with light, her voice commanding the clans, her form shifting endlessly. He saw the valley reshaped, the spiral embedded in every stone, every breath. And he saw himself, watching from the edge, forgotten. Ash fought the vision, grounding himself in memory. He remembered her laughter, her defiance, her quiet strength. He remembered the nights they'd trained beneath the stars, the hunts, the choices. He remembered who she was before the spiral began to whisper. He stepped forward again, this time slower, steadier. "Raven," he said firmly, "you're not alone." She blinked and the spiral flickered. Her mark dimmed slightly. She turned, her eyes clearing, her breath catching. For a moment, she was herself again. Ash reached her side, placing a hand on her arm. "You don't have to become what it wants." Raven looked at him, her voice quiet. "I needed to see it, all of it." "And now?" he asked. She glanced back at the spiral, then at him. "Now I choose." The chamber held its breath. The spiral turned. And together, they stood at the edge of power, ready to face what came next.
The spiral pulsed with quiet intensity, its motion slower now, deliberate. Raven stood before it, her mark glowing in perfect sync, her breath steady despite the weight pressing against her chest. The chamber had grown silent, not empty, but expectant. The spiral was no longer revealing, it was offering. A wave of energy rose from its core, enveloping her in light. She felt her senses sharpen, every heartbeat in the valley, every whisper in the wind, every shift in the earth. The spiral showed her what could be, not visions, not illusions, possibility. She saw herself standing above the clans, her voice commanding the elements, her form shifting effortlessly between shapes. No pain, no limits, no resistance. The spiral offered her godhood, not as a title, but as a state of being. Complete mastery over all shifters, every transformation, every instinct, every thread of power woven into her will. The hollow house chants echoed faintly in her memory. They had always believed she was chosen. Now the spiral confirmed it. She would no longer lead, she would define. The clans would no longer follow, they would obey. Raven's mark flared, and the chamber responded. Symbols rose from the floor, orbiting her like stars. The spiral's energy surged, inviting her to step forward, to accept, to become. Ash's voice echoed in her thoughts, his warnings, his fear, his love. She saw him standing at the edge of the chamber, watching her with eyes that held both hope and dread. He had followed her here, risking everything, not to stop her, but to remind her of who she was. The spiral pressed again. It did not speak, but its meaning was clear. Take this power, end the war, shape the world, be more than mortal, be the spiral. Raven closed her eyes, the offer burning through her thoughts. She felt the pull, not just of power, but of purpose. She had fought for unity, for peace, for truth. But this was something else, something beyond choice, beyond consequence. She opened her eyes and stepped forward. The spiral flared, ready to bind itself to her completely. And Raven hesitated. She looked at her mark, then at the chamber, then at the memory of every clan, every sacrifice, every voice that had brought her here. She was not just a bearer, she was a witness, a leader, a soul.
The spiral did not punish. It revealed. As Raven stood in its light, The offer of godhood still pulsing around her, the chamber shifted once more. The symbols on the walls dimmed, and the air grew colder. The spiral turned slower now, deliberate, as if preparing her for what came next. She saw the future, not the one promised in power, but the one hidden beneath it. The spiral showed her a valley reshaped by her will, where clans bowed not in unity, but in fear. She saw herself standing alone, her mark blazing, her voice law. No one challenged her, no one dared, and no one truly followed. The Hollowed Hovel had grown into an empire, their chants now commands. The blood-born had vanished, their warnings buried beneath silence. Ash stood at her side, but his eyes were distant, his presence hollow. She had become the spiral's vessel, and in doing so had lost everything else. War did not end. It changed shape. Skirmishes became purges, dissent became treason. The spiral's cycle continued, not broken, but reinforced. Raven saw herself leading armies against shadows, fighting threats that never truly died. The valley bloomed, then burned, then bloomed again. And through it all, she remained unchanged, immortal, untouchable, alone. She felt the isolation like frost on her skin. The spiral did not offer companionship. It offered control. And control, once accepted, demanded distance. She saw herself in temples, in visions, in songs, but never in conversation, never in laughter, never in love. Ash's voice echoed faintly, a memory from before. You don't have to become what they fear. She looked at him now in the vision and saw the truth. He had feared this. Not her power, but its cost. The spiral had promised mastery, but it came with a price. Eternal war, eternal fear, eternal isolation. Raven stepped back, her breath catching. The spiral's light dimmed slightly, sensing her hesitation. It did not plead. It did not threaten. It simply continued to turn, waiting for her to decide. She looked down at her mark, still glowing, still listening. It had brought her here through prophecy, through fracture, through revelation. But now it was quiet, as if asking her what she truly wanted. Raven closed her eyes and saw the valley as it had been, imperfect, fragile, alive. She saw Ash's smile, the clans gathered in council, the sound of wolves howling beneath the stars. She saw a memory. She saw choice.
The spiral hovered before her, pulsing with quiet intensity. Its offer still lingered in the air. Godhood, mastery, permanence. Raven stood at the center of the chamber, her mark glowing softly, her breath calm. She had seen the truth, she had felt the cost, and now the choice was hers. Ash remained at her side, silent but present. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence reminded her of everything she had fought for: connection, memory, freedom. The spiral offered control, but it demanded isolation. It promised peace, but only through obedience. Raven had seen the cycle. She had seen herself within it, and she had seen what it would take to end it. She stepped forward, not to accept, but to confront. Her hand reached toward the spiral's core, not with hunger, but with resolution. The chamber responded instantly. Symbols flared. The air thickened. The spiral surged, sensing her intent. It did not resist. It did not plead. It simply turned faster, as if bracing for what came next. Raven placed her palm against the spiral's light. Her mark flared, brighter than ever before. The chamber shook, the walls pulsed, Energy surged through her body, not lifting her, but grounding her. She felt every shift, every echo, every memory the spiral had ever held. And then she let go. She released the power, not into the world, but into silence. Her mark dimmed. The spiral slowed. The symbols faded. The chamber grew still. Raven felt the energy leave her like a tide receding from the shore. Her body trembled, her breath faltered, but her spirit remained whole. Ash stepped forward, catching her as she staggered. Her mark was quiet now. No longer glowing, no longer humming. It was still. The spiral hovered, dim and silent, its cycle broken, not destroyed, released. Raven looked up at it one last time. "You were never meant to be held," she whispered, "only understood." The spiral pulsed once, then faded into the chamber walls. The symbols vanished, the light dimmed, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was peace. She had sacrificed her power, not for control, not for legacy, but for freedom. Ash held her close, his voice soft. "You did it." Raven nodded, her eyes tired but clear. "Now we begin again." The spiral was gone, but its echo would remain. In memory, in story, in the choice that changed everything.
The chamber was still. The spiral had faded, its light absorbed into silence. Its motion finally stilled. Raven stood in the center, her breath slow, her body trembling. The mark on her shoulder, once a beacon of power and prophecy, now glowed faintly, no longer pulsing, no longer commanding. It was quiet. It was fading. Ash helped her to her feet, his hands steady, his eyes searching hers for the woman he had followed into the depths. She met his gaze, and though her strength had diminished, her clarity had returned. She was not broken. She was not divine. She was simply Raven again. They stepped out of the chamber together, the stone door closing behind them with a soft hum. The valley greeted them with silence. No chants, no weapons, just the wind moving gently through the trees. Word spread quickly. The spiral was gone. The bearer had returned. Clans emerged from their camps, cautious but curious. The hollow howl approached first, their eyes wide, their voices hushed. They saw the mark, dim and quiet, and understood. Raven had not ascended. She had chosen something else, something harder, something human. The Bloodborne watched from a distance, their expressions unreadable. Kyle nodded once, a gesture of respect, of recognition. She had warned of the spiral's cost. Raven had paid it. Raven spoke little in those first hours. She walked the summit slowly, touching the stones, listening to the wind, watching the faces of those who had once feared her, worshipped her, followed her. She did not command. She did not explain. She simply existed, changed, quiet, whole. Ash stayed close, his presence steady. He had seen her at the edge of godhood. He had seen her turn away. And now he saw her return, not as a symbol, but as a soul. The mark faded further with each passing hour. It no longer glowed. It no longer hummed. It became a scar, soft, silent, a reminder of what had been and what would never be again. Raven stood at the summit one last time before dusk, watching the valley breathe. The clans had begun to gather again, not in fear, not in worship, but in curiosity. They saw her not as a bearer, but as a witness, and in that, they found something new. The spiral was gone, but Raven remained, and in her quiet, the valley began to heal.
Ash stood at the edge of the summit, watching the valley stretch out beneath a sky that finally felt still. The spiral was gone, its hum silenced, its rhythm broken. Yet the memory of it lingered, in the stones, in the wind, and most of all in him. He had survived the descent, the visions, the confrontation, But survival came with weight. He had seen Raven at the edge of godhood, her mark blazing, her voice echoing with power. He had seen her hesitate, then choose. Not mastery, not immortality, but sacrifice. And now he carried that moment like a scar. Raven moved quietly through the valley, her presence no longer commanding, but grounding. Her mark had faded to a soft outline, barely visible beneath her skin. She spoke little, smiled rarely, and when she did, it was with a kind of sadness that Ash understood too well. He remembered the spiral's offer, the chamber's light, and the way her hand had trembled before she let go. It had been the right choice. He knew that, but knowing didn't make it easier. The clans had begun to rebuild. The hollow howl had quieted, their chants replaced by reflection. The Bloodborne had stepped forward, not as rivals, but as witnesses. Peace was possible now, but peace had its own silence, and in that silence Ash often found himself replaying the moment she turned away from power. He didn't speak of it, not to the elders, not to the warriors, not even to Raven. But it lived in him, in the way he watched her, in the way he walked the valley, in the way he listened for echoes that no longer came. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the summit glowed with fading light, Raven joined him. They sat together without words, the wind brushing past like a memory. She reached for his hand, and he let her. "I remember," she said softly. Ash nodded. "So do I." They didn't need to say more. The spiral was gone, but its shadow remained, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what was offered, of what was refused, of what was saved. Ash had survived, but he would never forget what she gave up to make that possible.
The valley was quiet, but not empty. The spiral was gone, its influence broken, and in its absence, something new began to take root. The clans emerged slowly from their fractured camps, not with banners or blades, but with open hands and cautious steps. They had seen war. They had seen prophecy. They had seen Raven choose sacrifice over power. And now they chose something else. Rebuilding did not begin with stone or strategy. It began with conversation. Warriors who once stood on opposite sides sat together beneath the old tree, sharing stories of what they had feared, what they had lost, and what they hoped to find again. Elders gathered not to command, but to listen. The hollow howl, once fervent in their devotion, laid down their symbols and joined the circle. The Bloodborne, long silent, spoke of scars and survival. Raven did not lead them. She walked among them, quiet and present, her mark faded to a soft outline. She offered no orders, no visions, no declarations. She simply listened, and in her silence, the clans found space to speak. Ash helped where he could, repairing shelters, tending to wounds, guiding scouts through the forest. He carried the memory of what had been, but he did not let it define what came next. He saw the valley not as a place of prophecy, but as a place of possibility. Together, the clans began to write a new truth, not a code of dominance, not a doctrine of power, but a shared understanding that no one voice should rise above all others, that memory mattered more than mastery, that unity was not forged in obedience, but in choice. They carved this truth into stone, not as law, but as legacy. A spiral, broken at its center, surrounded by symbols from every clan. It stood at the summit, not as a monument to Raven, but as a reminder of what she gave up and what they must protect. The valley breathed again. Children played in the fields, wolves howled beneath the stars. The wind carried laughter instead of warnings. And though the spiral was gone, its echo remained, not in fear, but in wisdom. The clans had rebuilt, not under a leader, but under a truth they chose together.
The Bloodborne had always stood apart, watchful, silent, burdened by history. When the spiral was broken, they did not celebrate. They did not mourn. They waited.
And when the valley began to rebuild, they stepped forward, not as warriors, but as witnesses. Hale led them to the summit, her crimson cloak faded by time and memory. She carried no weapon, only a scroll wrapped in cloth, its edges worn, its ink faded. Raven met her there, her mark quiet, her presence grounded. The clans gathered in cautious silence, unsure of what would come next. Kale spoke with calm clarity. We were not born to fight. We were shaped by what the spiral left behind. We carry its scars, not on our skin, but in our stories. She unwrapped the scroll and laid it on the stone. Symbols danced across its surface, spirals broken, names erased, moments preserved in fragments. It was not a record of victory. It was a record of survival, of choices made in desperation, of truths buried to protect what remained. The Bloodborne had sealed the spiral once before. They had watched a bearer rise, then fall. They had seen the valley fracture, and they had chosen silence over war. But silence, Kale admitted, had its own cost. It had bred fear, isolation, misunderstanding. Now they offered peace, not as surrender, but as reconciliation. They shared their stories, their losses, their regrets. They spoke of the spiral's influence, of the burden of bearing its memory, of the weight of watching history repeat. And they asked for nothing in return. Raven listened, her eyes steady, her voice quiet. You kept the valley alive, even when it didn't know it needed saving. Kale nodded, and now we help it heal. The clans responded not with applause, but with understanding. Warriors from Emberclaw and Stonefang approached the Bloodborne, offering food, shelter, conversation. The Hollow Howl, once fierce in their devotion, sat beside them, asking questions, sharing songs. The summit became a place of exchange, not of power, but of memory. Ash watched it unfold, his heart heavy but hopeful. The spiral had left scars in all of them, but now those scars were being named, and in naming them, they began to fade. The Bloodborne remained in the valley, not as guardians of silence, but as keepers of truth. Their scrolls were copied, their stories were told, and their presence reminded everyone that peace was not the absence of conflict, it was the choice to face it together. The spiral was gone, but the lessons it left behind were finally being shared.
The summit was quiet, the stones still warm from the fires of change. The clans had gathered, not to crown a leader, but to carve a truth. The spiral was gone, its cycle broken, and in its place, something new was ready to be born. Elders from every clan sat in a circle, scrolls spread before them, voices low but steady. They spoke not of power, but of memory, of the choices that had brought them here, of the sacrifices made, of the silence that had once divided them. Raven sat among them, her mark faded, her presence calm. She did not speak often, but when she did, the room listened. The Bloodborne offered fragments of the old code, lines etched in secrecy, now shared in trust. The Hollow Howl contributed chants once used for worship, now rewritten as reflections. Even the youngest among them added their voices, asking questions, proposing symbols, shaping the future with curiosity instead of fear. Together, they wrote a new code. It did not name a bearer. It did not promise unity through control. It honored memory of the spiral, of the fracture, of the healing. It spoke of balance, of choice, of the right to question. It was not a law, it was a legacy. They carved it into stone at the summit's edge beside the broken spiral. The symbols were simple. A circle open at one end, a mark faded at its center, and beneath it, the words they all agreed upon. We remember, we choose, we share. Raven traced the final line with her fingers, then stepped back. Ash stood beside her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. No one bowed, no one knelt. They simply stood together, watching the code settle into the stone. The valley was quiet that night, not with silence, but with peace, and the future, for the first time, felt like something they could shape together.
The valley had settled into rhythm. Not the rhythm of prophecy or war, but of life. Quiet, imperfect, enduring. The spiral was gone, its echo fading into story, and the clans had begun to look forward instead of back. Raven and Ash stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching a circle of young shifters stumble through their first forms. Limbs too long, instincts too fast, laughter breaking through every failed attempt. It was messy. It was beautiful. They didn't teach from scrolls or doctrine. They taught from memory. Raven showed them how to listen to the wind, how to feel the shift before it came. Ash taught them how to see beyond the moment, how to trust vision without being consumed by it. Together they guided not with authority, but with presence. The young ones asked questions Raven had never heard before, not about power, but about choice. Not about the spiral, but about the mark. She told them what it had meant, what it had offered, and why she had let it go. They listened, not in awe, but in understanding. The clans sent their children freely now. No banners, no allegiance, just curiosity. The training grounds became a place of exchange, of laughter, of growth. The old divisions faded. The new generation didn't carry the weight of prophecy. They carried the promise of something better. Raven watched them shift, awkward, joyful, unafraid. She saw herself in their stumbles, in their questions, in their quiet determination. Ash stood beside her, arms crossed, a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "They're not like us," he said. Raven nodded. "That's the point." The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the field. The young shifters continued to train, their movements wild and free. Raven and Ash didn't correct them. They simply watched, knowing that the future didn't need to be shaped. It only needed to be trusted.
The morning was quiet, the valley wrapped in mist and memory. Raven stood alone beneath the old tree, the summit behind her, the future ahead. The wind moved gently through the leaves, carrying no prophecy, no fear, only the hush of something ending. She reached for the edge of her cloak, brushing it aside. Her shoulder, once marked by the spiral's fire, now bore only a faded outline. But as the sun broke through the clouds, a soft glow stirred beneath her skin, brief, gentle, unmistakable. Her mark pulsed once, not in power, not in warning, just an echo. She closed her eyes and let it pass through her. It didn't surge, it didn't speak, it simply reminded her of what had been, of the chamber, the choice, the silence that followed. It was not a call to return, it was a whisper of farewell. Ash watched from a distance, knowing better than to interrupt. He had seen the spiral fade, he had seen Raven change, and now he saw something else, something quieter, a final note in a song that had once shaken the valley. The glow faded, the mark stilled. Raven lowered her cloak and turned toward the forest path. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The spiral was gone, but its echo had found peace. And with that, the last chapter began.
Ash had not dreamed in weeks. Since the spiral faded, his visions had quieted, retreating into silence like waves after a storm. He welcomed the stillness. It meant peace. It meant rest. But on the eve of the solstice, as the valley slept beneath the blanket of stars, the silence broke. The vision came gently, like mist curling through trees. Ash stood in a forest he did not recognize. Tall pines, soft moss, a hush that felt sacred. Light filtered through the canopy in golden strands, and in the clearing ahead, a figure stood. A child. Small, steady, barefoot in the dew. Her hair was dark, her stance familiar, and when she turned, Ash saw her eyes. Clear, quiet, unmistakable. Raven's eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The vision held no prophecy, no warning, only presence. The child knelt beside a stone, tracing a spiral carved into its surface. Not broken, not glowing, just remembered. She looked up at Ash and smiled, then turned back to the forest, walking deeper into the light. Ash woke with the image still burning behind his eyes. He sat in silence, the morning soft around him, the world unchanged. But something lingered. Not fear, not urgency, hope. He didn't tell Raven right away. He simply watched her as she trained the young ones, her laughter quiet, her movements graceful. She had given up power, but something had remained, something that would outlive both of them. Later, as they walked the forest path together, he finally spoke. "I saw her. A child. With your eyes." Raven didn't stop. She didn't ask. She just smiled, and the forest, ancient and listening, held the moment like a secret.
The valley had known many ceremonies, crowning leaders, forging alliances, mourning the fallen. But this one was different. There were no banners, no chants, no declarations, only silence and the sound of footsteps gathering at the summit. The clans came together beneath a sky streaked with gold, the last light of winter casting long shadows across the stone. Elders carried scrolls wrapped in cloth, their edges worn, their ink faded. These were the old codes, the laws written in fear, in dominance, in the shadow of the spiral. Raven and Ash stood at the center, not as leaders, but as witnesses. The stone circle had been cleared, a shallow pit carved into its heart. One by one, the scrolls were placed inside. The hollow howl laid down their chants. The bloodborn offered their sealed records. Even the youngest clans contributed fragments, stories passed down that no longer served the world they were building. No one spoke as the pit was filled. The silence was not heavy. It was sacred. Ash stepped forward first, placing a single stone atop the scrolls. Raven followed, her fingers brushing the surface gently. Then the others joined, building a cairn, not to forget, but to remember differently. When the last stone was placed, Kel spoke softly. "We bury what bound us. We keep what shaped us." Raven nodded, and we walk forward. The ceremony ended without fanfare. The clans dispersed slowly, their steps light, their voices low. The cairn remained, a quiet monument to what had been surrendered and what had been reclaimed. That night, the valley was still. The stars burned bright, and beneath them, the old code rested in the earth, no longer a weight, but a memory.
The summit was quiet, the cairn of buried scrolls casting a long shadow in the morning light. The clans had gathered once more, not for war, not for prophecy, but for remembrance. It was not a coronation, it was not a farewell, it was something gentler, something earned. Raven stood before them, no cloak, no mark, no title, just herself. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of thawing snow and new growth. She looked out at the faces, young and old, loyal and once divided, and saw not followers, but fellow witnesses. She didn't speak from a stone pedestal. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped forward and began. "I was marked, and I was changed. not by power, but by choice. I saw what the spiral offered. I saw what it demanded, and I chose to let it go. The clans listened, not in reverence, but in recognition. They had seen her journey, they had felt its tremors, and now they heard its truth. I am not your leader. I am your memory. I am your reminder that power is not what binds us, that legacy is not what defines us, that change is not what we fear, it is what we choose. Ash stood nearby, his eyes steady, his presence quiet. He had heard her speak many times, but never like this. Raven looked at the cairn, then back at the valley. We buried the old code. We wrote a new one. But what matters most is not what's carved in stone. It's what we carry in silence, in story, in each other. She stepped back. No applause followed, no chants, just a hush that felt sacred. The clans dispersed slowly, their steps light, their hearts full. Raven remained at the summit a while longer, watching the snow melt, the trees stir, the sky open. She had spoken, not as a leader, but as a witness. And the valley, listening, began to bloom.
The thaw came slowly at first, drips from the summit stones, soft cracks in the river's frozen skin. Then, all at once, the valley awakened. Snow retreated into the shadows, and green pushed through the frost like memory returning to the land. Spring had arrived. The trees, once bare and brittle, stretched toward the sky with new leaves. Flowers bloomed in places untouched for seasons. The air carried warmth, not just in temperature, but in spirit. It was the kind of warmth that came after survival, after choice, after change. Children ran through the fields chasing wolves who no longer feared the sound of laughter. Elders sat beneath the old tree, telling stories not of war but of healing. The cairn at the summit remained untouched, its stones settled, its silence respected. It was no longer a warning, it was a promise. Raven walked the valley paths with Ash beside her, their steps slow, their presence quiet. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The land spoke for them now, in bloom, in birdsong, in the rhythm of a world no longer held by prophecy. The clans planted together. They hunted together. They dreamed together. And the spiral, once a shadow over every decision, had become a story told at dusk, soft, distant, remembered. Spring did not erase what had come before. It honored it, in every petal, in every breeze, in every step forward. The valley bloomed, and with it, so did the future.
The valley was quiet, wrapped in the soft breath of spring. The cairn stood at the summit, its stones settled, its silence complete. The clans had returned to their lives, planting, hunting, dreaming. The spiral was no longer spoken of in fear or reverence. It had become something else, a legend. Raven and Ash stood at the edge of the forest, the path ahead dappled in golden light. They didn't carry weapons, they didn't wear cloaks. They carried only memory of what had been, of what was saved, of what was chosen. The trees welcomed them, their branches swaying gently, their roots deep and listening. Birds sang overhead, and the wind moved through the leaves like a whisper of something ancient, something ending. Raven reached for Ash's hand. He took it without hesitation. They walked forward, step by step, into the forest's embrace. No ceremony followed, no crowd watched, just the rhythm of two souls moving toward peace. Behind them, the spiral faded, not in fire, not in silence, but in story. It would be told around fires, carved into stone, remembered in dreams. But it would no longer shape the world. It would no longer choose. It had been broken. It had been understood. And now it was legend.
The forest closed gently behind them, the light softening, the path winding deeper. Raven and Ash did not look back. They didn't need to. The valley bloomed, and the story was complete.